All right, guys, so I feel like I have a little bit of an easier job than Sully and CJ did. And I'm here to talk about stress as it relates to resistance training. And, CJ gave a definition of stress. I'm going to use the definition of stress that RIP uses in practical programming. So stress can be defined as any event that produces a change in the physiological state of an organism. So if we're working off of that and we want to know how do we best apply stress through resistance training, I thought the best way to go about it would be to look at the individual variables in which we apply that stress. So what I did was a little breakdown of the literature on exercise selection, volume, frequency, intensity, and finish it up with a little bit of a look at periodization and RPE. So I'm looking forward to talking about that. All right, so jumping right into it with exercise selection. So this article that came out in 2015 by this DeFranco research group. So 20 young men with at least 2 years of resistance training experience randomized into two groups. A group that performed only multi-joint exercises for the upper body. They performed chest press, overhead press, rows and pull downs essentially, and a multi-joint and single joint group. So essentially they followed that same multi-joint protocol with the addition of curls and triceps extensions, okay? So they performed 8 weeks using the article says linear periodization model, but they actually did not use linear periodization. They did 2 4-week blocks. So right off the bat, you kind of are questioning, what's going on here. But so they measured elbow flexor and extensor 1 RM, as well as took some circumference measurements of the upper limb pre and post, okay? So what these guys found was basically that both groups significantly increased their 1 RM and their upper arm circumference. Comparisons between groups revealed no significant differences statistically between the multi-joint only group and the multi-joint plus the single joint exercise. And the big focus of their paper was essentially the biggest reason that most people don't train is because they talk about time constraints. So if you can minimize that by giving them a resistance training program that focuses on multi-joint exercise and they can still get the same benefit whether or not they include the single joint exercise, then why wouldn't we want to promote that? Which I think is a pretty reasonable approach to take. So this group followed it up in 2017 with a review of the literature on this topic. So this is the same research group. The lead author is different, which is oftentimes what you'll see, but these are the same people essentially that conducted this study, okay? So studies that were eligible for inclusion were experimental studies comparing multi-joint, single joint, or multi-joint and single joint. Resistance training, it was only healthy subjects, and they ultimately ended up with 23 studies that they included in this review, okay? And what they found, so no differences in surface EMG between single joint and multi-joint exercises when comparing prime movers. So as an example of that, there's a thought that an isolation exercise like a leg extension, you're going to get higher quadriceps activation than you would in something like a squat. And what this research found is that's actually not true. So the prime mover in a multi-joint exercise is going to work just as hard as it would if you had it work in an isolation type of fashion, okay? So long-term studies increase in muscle size and strength in the upper extremity reported no differences between single joint and multi-joint exercise. And that basically supports their previous research. So they concluded that people performing resistance training may not need to include single joint exercises in their programs at all to obtain equivalent results in terms of hypertrophy and strength. That all sounds good. That kind of comports with the way that we go about constructing our training programs for the most part with our clients. One of the studies that I actually thought was interesting that was included in this review was a study that looked at the difference between multi-joint upper body exercise. So they did chin-ups and pull-ups, they did overhead presses, and they did push-ups versus an isolated internal-external rotation shoulder strengthening protocol like you would get in a typical physical therapy type of situation. And our approach to shoulder rehab is a little bit different than what most PTs and orthopedists would recommend. And what they found in that study actually was that the multi-joint group improved internal and external rotator cuff strength greater than or more than the group that just did the isolation exercise. So that was kind of nested within this, this review article. Now, this is where things kind of get interesting. So anytime you see something that says a comment on, so this is another group of researchers essentially criticizing or critiquing the results of another paper that was previously published. So Schoenfeld and a couple of his colleagues had some concerns with that previous paper that I just talked about. And essentially, they did bring up some valid points. Now, what I will say is that none of their critiques of this paper really were in regards to the strength conclusions. So they were primarily concerned with hypertrophy. So I think that it's pretty reasonable to assume at this point that you don't need to do any single joint exercise if you're doing a multi-joint resistance training program. But so they, like I said, these guys were concerned really with hypertrophy, so they based their conclusions and recommendations for the upper extremity on studies that investigated only elbow flexors and extensors. They said elbow flexors, but it was flexors and extensors. So they specifically talked about the deltoid. So what about, you know, anterior versus posterior medial deltoid and things like that. They brought up the gastrocs in the lower extremity. If you're just doing something like squats or deadlifts, then the gastrocs is not going to be, you know, their hypertrophy won't be maximized and things like that. The previous study was titled, so they talk about long-term adaptations, but most of the studies in the review only lasted 8 to 10 weeks. So I don't think that we would necessarily consider that to be long-term from the way that we look at things. And of the 3 longitudinal studies, only two were actually carried out on untrained individuals. So we know the way that that works. You carry out a study on an untrained individual, and basically you're going to get positive results no matter what you do. So I think that those are valid critiques, but again, it really was only pertaining to the hypertrophy portion of the previous paper. So the take-home points in regards to exercise selection, essentially the research at this point would support the fact that for the upper extremity and lower extremity, there's really no additional benefit in terms of strength by adding single joint exercises to a resistance training protocol that already includes multi-joint exercises. Whether or not that's true for hypertrophy, it still requires future research. So moving on from there, we're going to talk about volume, okay? So in practical programming, RIP talks about volume as being, you know, sets times the number of sets you're doing multiplied by the weight, right? That's going to give you your training volume. In the barbell prescription, Sully kind of simplifies it and just says it's the total number of times an exercise performed. We know that it's going to be an inverse relationship with intensity, right? So a higher volume program is going to be lower in relative intensity, and that you can analyze volume over the course of a single training session, weeks, months, etc. So with that being said, these 2 articles published by the same author back in 2009 and 2010 essentially reviewed the literature in regards to the first one, so multiple sets versus single sets. So obviously a multiple set program is going to result in higher training volumes than something that is only a single set of the exercise. So for the first analysis that they did in regards to strength, 14 studies were included in the analysis, and they concluded that 2 to 3 sets per exercise were associated with 46% greater strength gains than 1 set in both trained and untrained subjects. The next year, he published a similar study that included 8 studies, and similarly found that multiple set resistance training programs are associated with 40% greater hypertrophy in comparison to single set programs in both trained and untrained individuals. So again, that would pretty much comport with the way that we go about things. For the most part, we prescribe multi-set programs to people. However, there's another critical review of these studies. So critical review of the meta-analysis that related to the strength portion of those 2 studies, okay? And Carpinelli is a researcher who has published a lot on the benefits of single set training to failure. And he's also written a lot of critical reviews. He wrote a position paper challenging the American College of Sports Medicine's position stand on resistance training. He did a similar paper in regards to the National Strength and Conditioning's position stand. And essentially, he is a really good researcher when it comes to digging into your references and picking them apart and finding all the flaws in the stuff that you're saying, okay? So his critique of Krieger's review essentially said that the validity of any meta-analysis is going to be dictated in part by the arbitrarily defined criteria of the researcher, right? Because when you do a meta-analysis, you are essentially defining the search terms. So you can include the types of studies that you want to include, and you can exclude studies that you don't want to include based on your own personal biases, okay? Aside from that, what he talks about, he went in that previous study, Krieger basically rated all the studies that he included in those 14 studies, that first study there in 2009. So Carpinelli went in and looked at his most highly rated studies and basically picked them apart and found that the data was kind of lacking. So again, like Sully was talking about before, you know, we have what we do practically that gives us good information, and that doesn't always align with the research. And for whatever you find, you know, to support something that you believe in, right? Well, I use multiple sets with people, and it works really well, so I would tend to believe that research. It sounds good to me. There's going to be something on the flip side of that that says, well, you know, that's not always going to be the case, and that sort of thing. So another one in regards to volume. So volume for muscle hypertrophy and health outcomes, the most effective variable in resistance training. So this is a newer one from 2018. And some quotes from this paper. So the literature has convincingly shown that the volume of resistance training has a dose-response effect on muscle hypertrophy and health outcomes, and that the doses causing a ceiling effect at this time are not even known. So essentially what they're saying is more is always better, right? And they're saying definitively that the greater the dose, the greater the effect when it comes to resistance training volume, okay? Increasing training volume may be the most easily modifiable variable causing beneficial adaptations in an exercise program. Okay, so what do you think about that? Of course, there's going to be another researcher who had a problem with this article and published a paper that says that this is total crap, okay? So a comment on volume for muscle hypertrophy and health outcomes. So going into the references used in that previous paper, so Schoenfeld showed no difference between volumes when classified between less than 5 sets, 5 to 9, and 10 plus sets, okay? And when you actually break it down, each additional set beyond a certain point would only result in a 0.37% improvement. So then that goes back to the time efficiency, right? When is more not necessarily better? You know, when do you start to minimize your improvements to the point where it's not even practical anymore? The previous study by Krieger that I already cited, so if you notice there in the results, it said 2 to 3 sets was better than 1. He also looked at 4 to 6 sets and found no difference between 2 to 3 sets and 4 to 6 sets. So that would contradict the claim that there is a definitive dose-response relationship, that more is always better, okay? Another study by Wernburn suggests the existence of a plateau in training volume, which I think, you know, we all to a certain extent would agree with. And another study observed no difference in hypertrophy between 1 and 4 sets per exercise when training to muscular failure. So that's another kind of issue in the literature that we'll talk about a little bit later, training to failure versus not training to failure, okay, and how that affects muscle recruitment and the results that you're going to get from your training. So in regards to frequency, so Will actually has some stuff on frequency that I think is going to be a little bit different than this, which is fine because that's the nature of this stuff when you dig into it. So the effect of resistance training frequency on gains in muscular strength, a systematic review and meta-analysis. This was published in 2018. Again, Schoenfeld was a part of this research group. So results suggest a significant effect of resistance training frequency, as a higher resistance training frequency is ultimately translated into greater muscular strength gains, but it seems to be primarily tied to the fact that the greater the frequency, the more training volume you're going to get. So, so essentially, the greater the frequency, the more your volume is going to be, and that would kind of comport with the idea that as your volume goes up, you're going to see an improvement in strength. So they concluded that higher resistance training frequencies results in greater gains in strength in multi-joint exercises in the upper extremity and in women. Young individuals seem to respond more positively to greater resistance training frequencies, which the next article is going to say kind of the opposite. And this is in contrast to older adults. So in this study, in this review, they found that older adults did not respond well to higher frequencies, and if higher frequencies translate to higher volume, then that would kind of support the notion that older adults are volume sensitive, okay? And again, they say more evidence among actually resistance-trained individuals is needed because most of these studies were performed on your typical untrained participant, okay? This next study that was also published in 2018 looked at weekly training frequency and its effects on strength gain, also a meta-analysis. So what they said, when programs are equated for weekly training volume, low frequency and high frequency programs produce similar gains in strength, okay? So use of a low frequency program may be appropriate to produce strength gains for untrained or older individuals. Strength gain progression in high frequency programs can be used as an effective method for increasing training volume, which can be associated with increased strength. And their final conclusion is that there's an absence of quality experimental data. Okay, so if you're not noticing the theme here, it tends to be the same every year when we look at this stuff, is that the data is not really all that good. So the take-home points on volume and frequency at this point, so we can assume for the most part that increasing volume over time appears to be an effective method to increase hypertrophy and strength. Older adults and untrained individuals can make progress on lower volume and frequency programs because it's just easier for them to adapt, right? They're further from their genetic potential. And the primary benefit of increasing frequency appears to be related to the corresponding increase in training volume. All right, so I know I'm going quick because I have a lot of slides, and you guys have been sitting here a while, and we still have 2 more people to get through. So in terms of intensity, good? All right, okay. So in terms of intensity, now intensity is defined in different ways within the resistance training literature. Is it intensity of effort? Is it training to muscular failure? The most common way, though, that it is presented is as some percentage of your 1 repetition maximum. So the higher the percentage, the greater the intensity, okay? So that's what we're going to use here in our discussion of intensity. And the intensity thing over the last couple years has focused primarily on high load versus low load resistance training. So you guys who are around in 2016, you'd know that we did an extensive review of one of those articles that gained a lot of attention. I'm going to just refresh you guys on that here in case you missed it. All right, so this first one, again, Schoenfeld's, this guy publishes like 10 studies a year. I don't know how that's possible, but he does. So muscular adaptation in low versus high load resistance training, a meta-analysis published in 2016. So they did a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials to compare the effect of low load, which they defined as less than or equal to 60% of 1RM, versus high load, which was greater than or equal to 65% 1RM, okay? So a 5% difference. So the criteria, again, in a meta-analysis, going back to that Carpinelli article, is arbitrarily defined, right? Where did they come up with that number? That's just what they decided to do, right? So that's how they got it. So the strength analysis ultimately comprised a total of 251 subjects that they drew from 9 different studies, okay? The hypertrophy analysis was a total of 191 subjects taken from a total of 8 different studies, all right? So they found a trend for strength outcomes to be greater with higher loads compared to low loads, and a trend for hypertrophy outcomes to be greater with high loads compared to low loads, but not stuff that was statistically significant. Now, I would argue, is it possible that that's because the difference, you know, between some of those studies were as little as 5% in terms of what they were looking at? Probably, but you know, we're going to talk about some other studies that kind of show this more definitively. But one of the things that came out of this study was that training with loads less than 50% of 1RM was found to promote substantial increases in muscle strength and hypertrophy, again, in untrained individuals, right? So if you take someone who's been sitting on the couch their entire life and you have them do anything, you will get a positive result. So I don't think anybody here would argue with the fact that if they do any sort of resistance training that's progressive, even with very light loads and high repetitions, that they're going to see improvements in strength and hypertrophy. So this is the article that we reviewed in 2016, the Morton article, and this one gained a lot of attention. There was an article about it in the New York Times, and it's a heavily cited article at this point. So the purpose was to determine the effect of 12 weeks of higher repetition, low load versus lower repetition, high load resistance training on skeletal muscle hypertrophy and strength in resistance trained young men. And they concluded that 12 weeks of supervised higher and lower load per repetition resistance training programs were similarly effective in inducing skeletal muscle hypertrophy in resistance training participants when resistance training was performed to volitional failure, okay? So that's the results, and that's what everybody kind of ran with. They said, wow, there's no difference between if you just lift light weights or if you lift heavy weights, right? In the New York Times, and that's what you know, gained so much attention. Now, let's go back and look at the actual methodology of this paper. And this is not a joke. This is really what's in the paper. So, so the low repetition group performed 3 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions at approximately 75 to 90% of their 1RM. So everybody in here trains. How many of you, so we just had a meet in here yesterday, right? Anybody in here, can any of you guys perform 8 reps at 90% of your 1RM? Okay, now, on top of that, the exercises were performed as supersets. So again, no rationale for the protocol. They just came up with their own protocol, okay? They supersetted it, and they said, we're gonna give them 1 minute of rest between their sets. And then what's gonna happen when they can't actually hit the repetitions that we have prescribed for them is we're gonna lower the weight by 5 to 10% every time they don't hit their 8 to 12 reps. So ultimately, let's say you start at theoretically 90%, they let you rest a minute, now you don't get 8 reps, what happens? You drop 5 to 10%. Now you don't get 8 reps again, what happens? You drop 5 to 10%. So ultimately, are you lifting a heavy load anymore by the end of your 3 sets? No, I mean, the whole thing is a complete farce. The fact that this study got so much attention is just a total and complete joke in my opinion. But we'll probably hear about this on Facebook again, Sully, like we did last time. So the authors apparently yeah, they said they were very we were very unfair to them. We were very unfair to them. So Brett Contreras and Schoenfeld and some of these guys, we were very unfair to these guys because this is high quality stuff here, guys. I mean, we're just yeah, right. Yeah, we're just unfair, but we're not going to address any of the problems that you have. We're just jerks over at Starting Strength, you know, and we don't understand what they're trying to do here. Yeah. All right. So the other aspect of this is the 1RM was tested at baseline at weeks 3, 6, 9, and 12. So if you take a group that's lifting light weights, but you test their 1RM 5 times over the course of 12 weeks, do you think that could have an effect on their strength over time? You know, their ability to maintain 1RM strength over the course of the study. Now, in fairness to the authors, they do acknowledge that. They said if you train with light loads in order to maintain maximal strength, then you have to practice that, and you know, doing 1RMs periodically or heavy loads is helpful in that. So they do acknowledge that. The average session volume by the low repetition group was only about 62% of the high repetition group, and the authors actually do acknowledge in the paper that in a volume match situation, the low repetition resistance training would provide a greater stimulus for hypertrophy and strength gains. So they acknowledge that in the paper, but again, their conclusions say something different. So now we have this study that came out in 2017 by Schoenfeld that again was looking at this same type of stuff, so strength and hypertrophy adaptations between low versus high load resistance training, another systematic review and meta-analysis, and now instead of separating 60 to 65%, he just said low load is less than or equal to 60% and high load is greater than or equal to 60%. So now the line of demarcation is essentially nothing, right? So all sets in the training protocol had to be performed to muscular failure. They had to have at least one method of estimating changes in muscle mass or strength, a minimum 6-week training protocol, and only healthy participants. A total of 21 studies were included in this analysis. And what they found was gains in 1RM strength were significantly greater in favor of the high load group versus low load training. Changes in measures of muscle hypertrophy were similar between the conditions. So they basically indicate that if you want the benefits of maximal strength gain, then you have to lift heavy weights, but that you can increase muscle hypertrophy with lighter loads provided that you are training to muscular failure, okay? And again, I don't think that we would argue with any of those conclusions. So the take-home points in regards to intensity are essentially that heavy loads are needed in order to maximize gains in top-end strength, right? Doesn't mean that you can't get stronger with lighter loads, especially if you're not trained, but if you want to improve your top-end strength, then you have to train heavy. Lighter loads can be effective at increasing strength when performed to failure, and this is especially true like any type of training in an untrained population. And heavy loads and light loads can both be used to increase muscular hypertrophy, okay? So now we're going to kind of wrap this up by talking about periodization. So Sully touched on this already, so I'm not going to go into this all that much, just going to talk about a few of the different studies that have been published over the years and kind of move on from it. But this definition comes from an article that Fleck published in 1999, and essentially the goal is to optimize training during short as well as long periods of time, as well as to peak physical performance at particular points in time. So this is from that Fleck article. Essentially, I think he only had 9 references back in 1999 that he considered of enough quality to include in his review of periodized resistance training programs. So, the results of his study show that it's not that strong in favor of periodization. So periodized programs can result in greater strength gains in non-periodized multi-set and single-set programs. Very few studies have examined motor performance, body composition, short-term endurance changes, etc. And all studies are relatively short in nature. What I thought one of the interesting things that he talked about is due to the lack of significant difference in criterion measures between periodized and non-periodized programs in studies using untrained subjects, he concluded that it may not be necessary for untrained subjects to do any sort of periodized resistance training program until some base level of fitness has been achieved. Now, this is 20 years ago, and I would say that this conclusion has been largely forgotten, because if you look at the NSCA and the way that they recommend people resistance train, they talk about periodization right from the start, right? They put people on periodized resistance training programs right from the start of training, and going all the way back to 1999, Fleck would actually disagree with that notion, okay? So a little bit of a more recent review in 2004, meta-analysis of periodized versus non-periodized strength and power training programs. This was more definitive in terms of its results. So Rhea basically said that periodized resistance training programs were more effective than non-periodized resistance training programs for everybody. All individuals, all age groups, didn't matter. It's better, right? It's better than anything. And you know, going back to like the mid to late 90s, early 2000s, this is what the research kind of centered on, non-periodized versus periodized resistance training. I looked at a lot of that literature when I was doing the training registry stuff, and the non-periodized resistance training programs that they use in these studies, they don't talk about how they progress load, they don't talk about anything in there, they don't give you a lot of detail at all in terms of what they did to actually see if these people got stronger. They just said, oh, they performed 4 to 6 sets for 12 weeks at 80% of 1RM or something like that. Well, so you just had them do the same weight over and over again for 12, there was just a lot of information missing from these studies, but those are the types of studies that were included in these analyses here. Now, the more recent periodization literature, this is one from 2018 from Kiley, so periodization theory, confronting an inconvenient truth. So essentially, what he's saying is that since we started to use these periodization models, the science of stress has evolved, that we can't base our training specifically off of just a biologic model that we have to take into account other types of stresses in our lives, how life stress affects performance and injury rates and things like that. And he does have some good references basically showing that there's a growing body of evidence to support the notion that non-biologic stresses can negatively impact performance and increase the likelihood of injury. So what is this talking about? Well, he never really gets to that point. He just says that we need to kind of rethink the way we look at periodization, but he doesn't really suggest something, you know, to kind of replace it. But what it's leading towards is essentially more auto-regulatory type programs, okay? Instead of, all right, this is your 1RM, we're going to do percentages based off of that for the next 12 weeks, and then we'll see where we end up type of thing. Now, this study from 2010, the effect of an auto-regulatory progressive resistance exercise program versus linear periodization in college athletes. So they did a 6-week program of an auto-regulatory resistance exercise program, and they found that it was more effective than a traditional percentage-based program in collegiate football players. So they tested bench press and squat 1RM as well as 225 on the bench for reps, okay? And they, like I said, their conclusion was the auto-regulatory program worked better. Now, a big problem with this, in my opinion, is that the auto-regulatory program, they didn't use repetitions in reserve or RPE or anything like that. They had them take their work sets to failure, and then based off of the number of repetitions that they got, either adjusted their loads up, down, or kept them the same at the following training session, okay? Why is that a problem? Well, the other group that was training off of percentage did not train to failure. So it's a little hard to compare the two different groups, because when you train to failure, something that's been shown in the literature to happen is that you maximize your muscle recruitment. So when you hit failure, by definition, you are maximally recruiting all of your muscle fibers. So if you're not training to failure, there's no way to quantify the recruitment of the muscle fibers to the same extent. So when you have one group that's not training to failure versus a group that is, and they're on two different programs, it's a little bit hard to draw conclusions from that. So that's my biggest issue with this paper in particular. So, and the volume wasn't equated between the groups in this one either, okay? Now we get into RPE, right? This is now kind of bringing us up to speed. So first it was periodized versus non-periodized. The literature kind of decided periodization is better, even though there's not a lot of strong data to support it. Then they started looking at more auto-regulatory stuff, and now we're getting into RPE. Where did RPE come from? Well, essentially it's been used in aerobic exercise and aerobic exercise testing for years. Okay, the Borg scale, the rating of perceived exertion, we use it in our lab at my university all the time with people. And then, as far as I can tell, Mike Teixeira, who obviously we all know, a very successful competitive powerlifter, started using it with his powerlifting clients, right? Doing his programming with it, and from there it's just kind of grown. Now, what does the data say in regards to RPE? It's gained a lot of popularity over the last few years, right? Well, there really isn't a lot of data on RPE in the literature at this point. So this is a study that Mike Zordos did in 2016. So the aim was to compare RPE values measuring repetitions in reserve at particular intensities of 1RM in experienced and novice squatters. So they compared training velocity between groups at the same intensities, and then they took their, RPE essentially. So 29 subjects performed a 1RM squat followed by single repetitions with loads corresponding to 60, 75, and 90% of their 1RM, and then they backed off to 70% and did an 8-rep set essentially, okay? So the average training velocity was recorded at those at the singles that they did at 60, 75, and 90%, and the first and last rep of the 8-rep set, all right? So this is an acute situation. This was one session, right? That's what they did. And in 2019, this same research group published basically the exact same study using the exact same protocol, but looking at the bench press, all right? So they did one on the squat, and a couple years later, they came out with one on the bench press. So we just kind of combined the results of these. So both of them found differences in the average velocity and RPE between the experienced and novice groups at heavier loads. Okay, so the average velocity was slower in the experienced group for the squat at 1RM and 90% of 1RM. The average velocity was slower in the experienced group for the bench press at 1 RM, and the experienced group reported a higher RPE at 1 RM for both the squat and the bench press. Okay, so the data didn't exactly line up, but the authors concluded that the repetitions in reserve-based RPE scale is a practical method to regulate daily training load, without really saying why that is, given that there are these differences. And in my opinion, I think probably more than anything, this just shows that you're not really going to get good data when you have novices performing 1 RM in maximal effort lifts, because it's not really a true 1 RM like it would be for an experienced lifter. That's why the experienced lifters' lifts were slower, right, and reported a higher intensity of effort. But again, these are acute studies, right? Both of those are just one-day studies, a little snapshot into using RPE. What is there out there in regards to using RPE over time? That, again, not much. So Eric Helms did this study that was published in 2017, self-rated accuracy of rating of perceived exertion based load prescription in powerlifters. So they had a total of 12 subjects, and this was a 3-week-long protocol, okay? So they did a daily undulating periodization model, so they trained 3 times a week. They benched and squatted 3 times per week, and they deadlifted twice per week. One session was 8 reps at RPE 8. The next session, that was the hypertrophy day. The next session was the power day, 2 reps at RPE 8. And then the last session was 3 reps at RPE 9. That was the strength day, because 2 reps and 3 reps gives you a totally different, training stimulus, obviously. So, so the subjects self-selected their initial working set loads based on the target RPE. So they warmed them up, they worked up to whatever their work set was going to be, and they said, pick a weight that you think you're going to hit 8 reps at RPE 8. Yeah? Okay. 8 reps at RPE 8, or the 3 reps at RPE 8 and the 2 reps at RPE 9, whatever it was, right? And then they compared the differences between the target RPE and the actual RPE after that initial work set. Except, what was the actual RPE? Just what the lifter thought it was, right? It wasn't, so they didn't actually tell them to do as many repetitions as you can, because that would give you an indication of whether or not that was an accurate assessment, right? So if you do an RPE 8 and you're supposed to have 2 reps in the tank, and you just stop and you say, well, I actually think that was an 8.5. They say, oh, okay, let's record that, and that's very good, this is good data, so that's basically what they did here. I think that this would have been a more effective study had they actually had the lifters go to failure, from that point. So then you would see, well, they thought that they would have 2 reps in the tank, but they actually had 1, or they could do three more reps or something like that, but they didn't do that, so I think that's a limitation. This same research group published an additional study using the same type of 3-week model, but looking at regulating volume. But to be honest, the methodology is just so convoluted that I just can't even get into it. Sullivan's already telling me I'm running out of time, and this would have been a whole nother thing to get into. So I did not include that in fairness. So what these guys basically found is that no significant differences between target RPE and actual RPE on the lower repetition training sessions. The higher repetition sessions had more variability in terms of RPE, which would make sense. We talk about this in the programming lecture during the seminar weekends, right? If you had to do a 20-rep set, someone had a gun to your head, you think you'd be able to do another rep? Yeah, probably, right? Whereas if you had to do an all-out 1 RM and then they asked you to do another rep, probably not, right? So that would kind of comport with that. So the authors concluded that powerlifters can select loads to reach a self-rated target RPE with precision after a familiarization session explaining the use of RPE and the scale. But again, what is the precision there? It's still subjective. And the take-home points on periodization and RPE. Periodization appears to be an effective means to managing training stress, despite the fact that its scientific foundations have been brought to question. And RPE may be an effective way to manage training stress, but we really don't have a lot of good data on it at this point. And the one thing I do want to say in relationship to this, I know I'm running out of time, I'm sorry, and Nick D'Agostino and I talk about this. So Nick, you guys all know, he's one of our coaches, a good friend of mine. He talks about RPE in terms of persisters and avoiders, right? So how does Rip talk about RPE? It's going to be a way for people to avoid doing the work that they need to do to get stronger, right? But you do have people on the opposite end of the spectrum, right? So what about people who are always going to push themselves to the maximum? So you guys all know my wife, right? And she did some programming with Mike Teixeira for a while, and I don't think over the course of that time she ever hit an RPE greater than 8.5, okay? Meaning, if she did a rep that took 15 seconds, she'd put the bar down and she'd say 8.5, right? So that would be the opposite end of the spectrum, right? I would say, you know, that looked pretty heavy. I don't think you could have done another one there. No, I had 2 more in the tank on that one. So you're going to have people that use RPE as a way to avoid doing the work that they should be doing to get stronger. And you're going to have people at the opposite end of the spectrum that are always pushing themselves. At this point, there really isn't a lot of data out there like people would have you believe that this is the only way to go. I mean, that is a total fallacy. And I don't think that there's anything that would say it's any more effective at managing training than really anything else that we have out there. So taking this all home in regards to stress, so we know that multi-joint exercises basically appear to be an effective means to achieving both strength and hypertrophy. Training volume should probably gradually go up over time to maximize progress. High load, low repetition training provides a better overall strengthening stimulus, and periodization appears to be an effective way to manage the stress of training over time. But the most effective way to do that is as yet to be determined. So that is it for me. Thank you very much, guys.